Evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Bear with us for a couple minutes as we wait for the folks who are in attendance to join the Zoom room. So just hang tight for a few. Evening for those of you who are just joining us. We're still waiting a minute to let anyone else who's joining the Zoom room in. So hold on for one more minute before we get started. All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here tonight. I imagine others will be joining us as we go, but welcome and thank you so much for joining us for the presentation on the Bell Policy Center's annual ballot guide. My name is Chris DeGree-Kennedy. I'm the president of the Bell Policy Center. I started on July 1st after completing 8 years in the state legislature, and I'm so excited to be joining this team of folks who've been working on really important issues around economic mobility for a long time. For those of you who are not familiar with the Bell, this is a Colorado-based organization that was founded in the year 2000 around advancing economic policy ideas and trying to make sure that we were communicating in a common sense way about what are the economic challenges facing our state and how do tricky things like tax policy interact with the opportunities that are out there for regular folks who are just trying to work hard and get ahead. We really focus on four areas. Economic mobility is the core to our mission, making sure every Coloradan has real opportunities to get ahead. We've had an increasing focus on the caring economy, both for childcare and for direct care for older adults who are trying to stay in their homes as long as possible. We focus very carefully on equity gaps in the ways that our systems can either exacerbate or help alleviate racial disparities. And we do a lot of communications work on telling the economic story. What is going on with the economy for people in Colorado, and how do these things impact their lives? A couple of housekeeping notes off the top. Feel free to use the chat function as much as you'd like, but also if you have questions about the ballot guide, please use the Q&A function. So if you're not on Zoom every single day, if you look around the bar on the bottom of your screen, there will be a Q&A option. If you open it up, it'll create an opportunity for you to type questions in that we will answer as we go. Some of them will answer verbally, some of them will type answers for you. Also, just so you know, all of you will be automatically muted throughout this presentation, and we are recording this webinar. So the ballot guide is something that we're incredibly proud of, and it's been part of the Bell's work since the very beginning. We were one of the first organizations that put out a statewide ballot guide to help people understand the incredibly complex issues that the voters of Colorado are tasked with deciding, because like many states that have a citizens initiative process, certain policies can only be made by the voters. And that's especially true in Colorado, where anything related to tax policy is essentially in the hands of voters rather than the state legislature most of the time. But what you'll see in our ballot guide goes above and beyond what you often find in the blue book, because while we certainly do try to provide a balanced analysis where we explain both the pros and cons of the issues, we take it one layer deeper, and we explain the ways that these ballot measures could potentially impact people's lives. We have three key criteria that we use when evaluating certain measures. So some of them we write about, but then we don't endorse a position on. But for anything that has an impact on economic mobility, we weigh in on whether a yes vote or a no vote is in our opinion, in the best interest of the people of Colorado. And we score these measures on three key criteria: tax fairness, racial equity, and economic mobility. So as we work through the presentations, you'll have a chance to hear about all these issues. We'll also be posting links in the chat so you can go read our full ballot guide online. It is a long one because there are 14 statewide measures on the ballot this year, but it is a great place to get information. It is optimized for mobile, so the links that we post are great things for you to text to your friends if they have questions about ballot measures. Just text them to coloradoballotguide2024.com, and they will get everything they need to make informed choices about the ballot this year. So I'll be moderating the discussion today, but really front and center in the presentation will be our policy team. And I'd like to go and introduce the four members of our policy team right now. Andrea Kuick leads our policy team as the Director of Policy and Research. Joshua Mantell is our Fiscal Advocacy and Special Projects Manager. And Perrine Monet and Efren Garcia are our policy analysts who focus on the caring economy and housing and wealth building, respectively. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh to start taking us through the ballot guide itself.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So just to orient on what we're hoping to accomplish this evening, we will introduce all 14 statewide ballot measures. We have taken a position on 9 of them. 8 of those we will be talking about, as well as one that we remain neutral on that has sparked a lot of discussion in this state. We'll have some chances for you to chime in on trivia. We have questions around each of the topics that we're hoping to cover today, just to kind of give everybody a little baseline on some of the important facts as these measures are moving along in the process. And then, as Chris mentioned, we hope that you take this opportunity to ask us questions about these measures and their impacts on the state of Colorado. Please do use the Q&A button for that. And we also have some questions that I'm sure Chris will like to ask of our policy team to dig deeper into some of these really important topics that we're going to go over. So before we get into some of the deep dives of that, just kind of wanted to briefly go over 5 of the measures that we're not going to go over in great detail today. Of course, we do go into great detail in our ballot guide. So if you want to learn more about these, please do read up on them in our ballot guide. But for these other 5 measures, just want to kind of briefly mention what they are and what they do before we get into the other 9 measures that we'll spend a little bit more time on. So Amendment H is called the Judicial Discipline Procedures and Confidentiality. This will restructure the Judicial Commission on Discipline and Transparency in our state. Currently, it's manned or womaned by judicial peers to determine to go over the complaints about judges in the judicial system, and this would change it to so that it's covered by more than that. So it's members of the public and stakeholders within the judicial process. Amendment I is a constitutional bail exception for first-degree murder. Colorado recently repealed the death penalty in our state, but one of the unintended consequences of that is our Constitution says that that anybody accused of a capital offense is not allowed to post bail. Well, because we don't have capital offenses, this caused some issues with folks who were accused of committing first-degree murder and reached a certain evidence threshold. So this would make sure that those folks who meet that evidence threshold and are accused of first-degree murder are not allowed to post bail. Amendment K would move some constitutional election deadlines to give our county clerks more time to translate, format, and review the ballot. And we do not take a position on that. And then Proposition 127 would prohibit the hunting of bobcat, lynx, and mountain lions in our state. It's pretty basic on what that says and what it does. And then Proposition 129 would establish a new class of veterinary professionals in between a veterinarian technician and a fully licensed veterinarian. And so those are the 5 that are we won't go into great detail tonight, but as I said, we go into great detail in our ballot guide, so I would encourage you to look at those and check those out.
All right, so that brings us to our first trivia question of the night. We have several of these interspersed throughout the presentation, so please put your answers in the chat. If you're not defaulted to this, make sure your chat is directed to go to everyone that's in the Zoom room. But the first question is this: how many times prior to this year have Colorado voters been asked to raise taxes since Tabor was passed in 1992? Is it A, 4 times, B, 8 times, C, 12 times, or D, 18 times? Throw your guess in the chat and we'll answer in just 1 second. Okay, we have two correct guesses in the chat. The answer is C, 12 times. Many of these times have been for sin taxes, where marijuana and nicotine have been popular things to tax. A lot of the other efforts have not been very popular measures that have been proposed in the past, but it goes to show that this is really something that in Colorado, the voters make policy when it comes to taxes. All right, giving it back to Josh.
Thanks, Chris. So let's go over three measures related to Tabor. The first one is Amendment G, and this would, Colorado as a state currently has a senior and disabled homestead exemption, senior and disabled veteran homestead exemption. And this allows folks who have lived in their house for at least 10 years to get to get a certain percentage of the value off of their home so that they have to pay less in property taxes. This is in our Constitution, and this measure would extend that to a new group of folks who are veterans who have unemployment disability. And that is a designation sent by the Department of Veteran Affairs. And the reason why this is in the Tabor section is because in years where we have a Tabor surplus, money over our revenue cap, our constitutionally mandated revenue cap, this reimbursement to the counties for their property taxes that have been lost to this exemption are paid out of the Tabor surplus. If we do not have a surplus, it comes out of the general fund, and that means less money for other types of programs that we all care about. This would extend that to about 3,400 additional veterans. Right now, the cost is about $170 million to reimburse for those lost property taxes. This would only increase it by a little bit. And so the Bell Policy Center has supported this policy in the past, continues to support this policy, and make sure that those who have given to our country and our state and our freedom so much get a little bit back through property tax reduction. So that's Amendment G. The next one I want to go over is Proposition JJ. This is a purely Tabor question. So if folks remember, in 2019, we had a proposition on the ballot, Proposition DD, and this was to tax sports betting, to legalize and tax sports betting in our state. And if any of you have been watching live sports or live TV, you know for a fact that sports betting is legal in this state because you can't get away from it. And what happens with Tabor is that the nonpartisan legislative council staff projects the amount of money that will be raised from these measures. And if a tax brings in more money than is projected, it has to go back to the voters to determine whether all of that money should be kept by the state to be spent for the purpose it was designated, or does it go back to the people who paid the tax in that overage. For this particular measure, that would go back to sports betting operators in our state, but it's only $1.2 million. So legislative council staff said that this would bring in $29 million. It actually brought in $30.2 million. And because of Tabor, we have to ask the voters, and they have to reaffirm by 50% that they want to keep this money for the Colorado Water Plan. And the reason why this is important is the Colorado Water Plan, which was devised in about 2015, said that we need about $100 million per year from 2020 to 2050 in able to implement all of the projects needed to keep our water sources sustainable, clean, and available for both drinking and recreation and agriculture. We're not even close to that. As I said, this is $29 million, 30.2 in real terms right now. So we think that, yes, we should keep that $1.2 million. It does not make sense because the voters already agreed that we should tax sports betting. It does not make sense to send it back to sports betting operators. And that $1.2 million, while not a lot in the grand scheme of how much we need to implement the Colorado Water Plan, will do some good for at least a project or part of a project to ensure that communities across our state have access to water as the climate changes and drought becomes more problematic in our state. And the next one, the last one that I will go over is Proposition KK. This is an interesting one. This would create a new excise tax of 6.5% on firearms, firearm parts, and ammunition to go towards funding crime victim support services, veterans mental health services, youth behavioral support, and some school safety measures. The reason why this is so important is that generally we have gotten, as a state, our money from the federal government for these types of services. The Victims of Crime Act, which was passed in 1984, collects money from those who are convicted of federal crimes and pay fines, and those fines go into a pot that is then distributed to states across the country to support their services. And that money, for a variety of reasons, has been cut in half since 2018 and will further decrease going forward. And we've been able to plug some of those holes through the money that the state and local governments received from the COVID relief bill that was passed in 2021. It's commonly known as ARPA. If you guys have heard of ARPA, that's what that is. But that money is running out. It has to be allocated by the end of this year and spent completely by the end of 2025, or it will go back to the federal government. And so there's a real need, and you'll see this kind of across the next couple of years as more and more services are looking to figure out how to fund the services that they had and are seeing some of that money dry up. And so the legislature put this measure on the ballot, and it's collected to project about $39 million annually by putting a simple tax on firearms, firearm parts, and ammunitions. And that money would go to a fund that the state would then disperse to community organizations throughout the state to help them cover the cost of these super and critically important services that we're seeing that are losing funding because of these variety of sources that are no longer keeping pace with the needs of the state. So that's Proposition KK. And with that, those are my three measures. And so I'll pass it back over to Chris.
One question for you, Josh, about the
Yes.
three measures you presented before we go on to this trivia question. With JJ, this idea of going back to the voters and asking them a second time if we can keep the money that they already voted on, this feels familiar. Why does that feel familiar?
So we've done this a variety of times. We did this most recently just this last year in 2023. If folks remember, we had Proposition II on the ballot. And that was an addition to Proposition EE. And Proposition EE, sorry, there's a lot of letters that when you're talking about the ballot. Proposition EE was the measure to tax tobacco and nicotine for purposes of funding universal preschool. And that projection, again, we came in over on tax money, some of that due to increase in smoking and just a general underestimating on how much it would bring in. And so we had to vote on Proposition II last year to keep that money instead of sending it back to tobacco. And we're looking at doing that possibly again. We passed Proposition FF, there's those letters again, Proposition FF to tax the wealthy to fund healthy school meals across our state. And we've already determined that we have more money coming in than what's projected. And so we will have to figure out what to do with that money in the future years. So this is an ongoing problem in Colorado. It costs money to run these ballot initiatives and to actually run elections. And so it's costly to continue doing this. And this is what Tabor has brought on our state. And one of the many issues that Tabor presents in trying to run a state in a fiscally responsible manner.
Yeah, and so theoretically, then with Prop KK, ammunition purchases exceed our projections, we might be looking at this yet again to make sure that we can keep all the revenues collected rather than returning them to the firearms manufacturers.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. It's a weird law. All right. So one of the things where you're going to see on this ballot is there's a lot of criminal justice policy being made on the ballot. We did a brief overview on amendments H and I a moment ago, but before we jump into Propositions 128 and 130, it's our next trivia question. How much general fund revenue in Colorado was appropriated to the Department of Public Safety in fiscal year 24-25? Was it 150.6 million, 227.8 million, 354.2 million, or 516.7 million? Toss your answers in the chat if you know. The correct answer is B, $227.8 million is how much we put in the Department of Public Safety in Colorado. With that, I'll pass it over to Efren Garcia.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So I'll be talking about Proposition 128. So Proposition 128 is requiring those who commit and are convicted of certain violent crimes to serve at least 85% of their sentence. Earned time wouldn't start accruing until 85% of that sentence has been served. And lastly, individuals convicted of at least 3 violent crimes would be no longer eligible for parole. So now it's really interesting to understand and look at the current research on the impact on public safety and recidivism with initiatives like this. So research indicates that longer incarceration periods don't necessarily enhance public safety or reduce recidivism rates. Studies have actually shown that earned time and early parole opportunities incentivize inmates to engage in rehabilitation programs, which can lower the likelihood of reoffending upon release. And so by reducing the ability to earn time and delaying parole eligibility, it may decrease inmate participation in such programs, potentially leading to higher recidivism rates. Secondly, Prop 128 would go into effect January 1st, 2025. A lot of the fiscal impacts wouldn't be seen within 20 years, according to the Legislative Council staff. It is actually projected that within 20 years, the annual ongoing cost for the state would increase from anywhere from 12 million to 28 million per year due to longer incarceration periods for affected individuals. And again, these costs are coming from resources required to house, feed, supervise inmates for longer sentences. And so that is one of the reasons why we are saying no to 128. The other proposition I'll talk about is Proposition 130. So Proposition 130 is looking to create a peace officer training and support fund within the Department of Public Safety. A total of 350 million would be allocated to this fund to help counties and cities retain police officers. The state would also be required to provide surviving family members of police officers killed in the line of duty with a $1 million benefit. So it's really interesting to look at, again, the relationship between public safety and more police officers. So there is research that presents mixed findings on whether increasing number of police officers increases public safety. While in some cases, there are some cases where there is a result, a decrease in crime, but there are many other cases that there is no difference. So there is not necessarily a relationship into decrease of crime when you have more police officers. In actuality, there's also other avenues to increase public safety that is also not as costly. Some of these ideas to increase public safety could be re-entry programs. So these are programs that support formerly incarcerated individuals into supporting them into reintegrating into society to reduce recidivism. And actually research has shown that it can decrease it as much as 62%. There are other related programs such as focus deterrence and other community-based programs that have better results and are also not as costly. So that is another reason why we are saying no. But in general, more policing doesn't necessarily equal better public safety. And in actuality, these measures like these actually have consequently negative impacts on communities of color as well.
Thanks, Efren. One of the things that I think is most interesting about this one is that the bulk of funding for law enforcement does not, in fact, come from the state government. These are local police departments funded by city governments and their sales taxes, county sheriff's offices paid for by county governments and their property taxes, whereas the state has only, offered occasional grants for very specific ways of supporting law enforcement. I think what's interesting here is we're talking about 350 million that is what the state government is supposed to be using for K-12 education, higher education, and healthcare. And so the trade-offs are really challenging when the state is asked to take on a much larger role for funding local law enforcement. I don't know if you have anything you'd want to add to that, Efren.
Yeah, actually, I do, Chris. Thank you for pointing that out. Actually, traditionally and systematically, historically, the relationship between local and state government is regarding funding of local enforcement or safe or public safety is actually not is not really dependent on the state government. Most of that funding actually it's meant to come from local government. Um, Again, public safety and policing are primarily the responsibilities of local government. So it makes sense that they are also making efforts to fund that. And there's two primarily ways that they can increase funding. And this is typically through regular budget practices, but it can also be through voter approved tax increases. So typically the state does not fund local government enforced law enforcement. But there's already been actually legislation to support public safety. Actually, in 2022, there was a bill that approved 30 million to dedicated to recruitment and retention to local law enforcement. And so the projected actual total amount of funding to the Department of Public Safety actually within the fiscal year of 2024-2025, their budget is already 280 million. So there's funding already there. Again, it's just that relationship typically is not on the state. It's more on local governments to have that responsibility to fund their local law enforcement.
Thank you, Efren. As you all can see, these are some somewhat complicated questions to be putting before the voters. And with both Props 128 and 130, there's really no reason that the legislature can't do these things themselves if they wanted to, or if they thought it was the appropriate priority. Both of these measures are being pushed by a conservative group that also was proposing measures that would have had dramatic property tax cuts had those measures appeared on the ballot. And one of the other measures we'll be talking about a little bit later in the program. But closing the door on public safety policy for one moment and moving into policies that are traditionally considered social policies, but we're going to tell you about the economic connections, brings us to our next trivia question. So a number of states since the Dobbs decision are taking action on abortion rights in their own states. How many states have a measure on this November 2024 ballot about abortion? Is it A, 6, B, 10, C, 15, or D, 21? Throw your answers in the chat. I hope a lot of people are betting on C. Any rebellious voices in the crowd that want to have a different guess? All right. Well, the correct answer is B. There are 10 measures being proposed in a variety of different states this year. It's worth noting that there were measures on ballots last year as well. So it probably is more like 15 states that between this year and previous years will have had a measure on the ballot, but there are 10 measures this year. With that, I will hand it over to Perrine.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, I will be talking about not only Amendment 79, which covers the right to abortion. Colorado is one of those 10 states, but I'll also be talking about Amendment J, the freedom to marry. And as Chris mentioned, both of these are traditionally thought of as social issues, but actually are very important for economic mobility as well. So Amendment J, just quickly, is pretty simple. It just takes language out of our Constitution that states marriage is between a man and a woman. So in Colorado currently, we do recognize same-sex marriage because of the US Supreme Court case, Obergefell versus Hodges. However, if that decision was ever to be overturned, in Colorado, we would default to our Constitution, which says marriage is between a man and a woman, unless Amendment J passes. And that's important because prior to this federal court decision, research did actually show the impacts on economic mobility. So for example, people in same-sex partnerships were less likely to have health insurance coverage. That was because, often a health insurance plan can be extended to a spouse, for example, but that same benefit was not afforded to people in same-sex partnerships because they were not legally recognized as such. And we know that health insurance is obviously important for a person's economic security and stability. And so that's one of the reasons that we recommend a yes vote on Amendment J, and to ensure that in Colorado we protect that same-sex partnerships have the same benefits and access to things like health insurance and other tax benefits as opposite-sex partnerships. So moving on to Amendment 79, this amendment does two things. So first, it puts the right to an abortion in our state constitution, and then it repeals the ban on the use of public funding for abortions. So importantly, this will allow the state the option to use public funds on abortions, thinking about like Medicaid or state and local government employee insurance, but it does not guarantee it. That would still need a future funding decision. It is also important to know that in Colorado, abortion is already legal statutorily in our state law. But this would just go above and beyond that to ensure its protection in our state constitution. And abortion is also important for economic mobility because access to abortion care and sort of the ability to choose when, if, and how many children someone has is very closely tied and impacts their financial health. It's tied to labor force participation, among other things. But the really important thing about this measure, in addition to that, is its impacts on racial equity. So we know that low-income women who are disproportionately women of color are more likely to rely on public health insurance. And so actually this ban on the use of public funding for abortions places a disproportionate barrier for women of color in accessing abortion care, which again is important for financial health and reproductive health as well. And so for those reasons, we also recommend a yes vote on Amendment 79.
Thank you very much, Perrine. And as we move on to our final two measures here, we have a trivia question for you about school voucher programs. So for fiscal year 23-24, how much money did Arizona set aside to fund their so-called education savings accounts? Was it 22 million, 146 million, 257 million, 421 million, or $624 million? Put your answers in the chat. All right, a real diversity of guesses here. Basically, people are ruling out 22 million. They know it's more than that, but otherwise it's a big question mark. Okay, well, John was right. The correct answer is E, $624 million. So with that, as we dive into the last two measures and arguably some of the most complex measures on the ballot, we'll leave it to none other than our policy director, Andrea Kulik.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll start first with Amendment 80. And I will just say, as Chris had mentioned from before, some of the ballot measures that you heard from the criminal justice space that are being run by Advance Colorado. They're a right-leaning group that, again, are supporting those criminal justice measures. They're also in support of Amendment 80, so they have a pretty big role in this coming election. So Amendment 80, what this does is it sounds pretty simple. I will say that just right off the bat, but essentially what this does is it puts the right to school choice into the state constitution. And so when we say school choice, it essentially just means that a family has the right to choose the educational setting that works best for their child. And so this could be anything from a public school to a future innovation school, so anything that may be happening in the future, private schools, homeschools, whatever you want to think about and where you might like to put your child. So when we talk about this, it's important to recognize that parents and families currently have the ability to do this, that it is currently in state statute that you can choose, again, the best choice for your child. But again, the change that this makes is that it puts it into the state constitution. And so there are a couple of big implications for that. And I think, again, whenever people talk about this, they say, oh, well, this is not really changing a whole lot. But one of the concerns that we, as well as many of our partners, really have, which is again really why we are in opposition to this, is that we think that this could lead to the use of public funds for private schools. And so as Chris had just alluded to with our trivia question just a little bit ago, there are pretty big fiscal implications for this. As you know, you saw within Arizona, whenever they had their new school voucher program, it was hundreds of millions of dollars. And in Colorado right now, we don't use any public money to fund any of these private schools. So that would be a really big change. I will just note on this is that what we have seen in other places as well, which is also a really big concern, is that when we start to fund private schools, as we've seen in other places, what that often means is that our public schools get less funding as well. So there is a direct implication for, again, the way that public schools are funded in our state. It also has some really big racial equity considerations that I just do want to finally highlight here. What we have seen in a lot of other places as well is that it doesn't, whenever we start funding private schools with vouchers and other types of public funding, we don't see a large uptick in the diversity of students that go to these private schools. Instead, it's a lot of those same students who stay in the private schools. They're just now getting public funding to do so. Importantly, within that, we do know that a disproportionate number of students who go to these private schools are often from urban areas, because if you think about it, there are often a lot more private schools in urban areas as opposed to in Alamosa or in Springfield or in Yuma. And so it's again, a lot more kids in your urban areas, but also very much more so a lot more white students, a lot more wealthy students as well. So there are a bunch of equity considerations that we would foresee down the future, which is again, why we and many of our partners very much oppose this measure.
I was trying to think of a question to ask to stump you, but I think you covered it there. So, and again, when we get to the end of this presentation, we can open it up for questions about any and all of these measures. So we'll just finish running through the presentation, and then we can open up the conversation about anything you'd like. But before we get on to the last measure, there's another name that you may have been hearing in the news lately, Kent Thiry, the former DaVita CEO, who has been very politically active, both funding ballot measures and making contributions to political campaigns. So the last trivia question is, how much money has Kent Thiry spent in state and federal campaigns? Oh, I don't think we put a time period on here, but basically over the last decade, let's say. Is it 2 million, 7 million, 10 million, 13 million, or $25 million that Kent Thiry has invested into politics in Colorado? Throw your answers in the chat. All right, the correct answer is D, $13 million. And with that, Andrea, why don't you tell us what Kent Thiry is trying to get voters to adopt in Colorado this year?
I would love to tell people what Kent Thiry is trying to do this coming year. So as we talk about this measure, and as Josh had alluded to at the beginning, we didn't take a position. This is the only measure that we're talking about here that we at the Bell did not take a position on. So just want to be clear about that at the very beginning. And the reason for that, just first, is that as we took a look at the rubrics, as Chris had mentioned at the beginning, how we evaluate ballot measures, we had some trouble figuring out exactly where it fell on some of our rubric. And so that, I think I'll touch on a little bit as I explain some of the implications of the measure. So I'll kind of get to that. And again, as we think about some of the evidence and some of the potential impacts of Proposition 131. But we are talking about it now because it is something that is just really complex, and is also something that has pretty large implications for the way in which we vote in Colorado. So we wanted to spend some time talking about it. So what Proposition 131 does is it changes the way that we elect certain officials within our state. And so it is not all officials that we are changing how we vote for. It is only select individuals or select offices. And so those include your US Senator, your US Representative, your state officers. So that would include folks like the governor, your Attorney General, your treasurer, as well as state senators and your state representatives. So essentially, it's not applying to your locally elected officials. It's also not applying to the US president. So important to recognize that. And it would mean that we would have different ways that we elect elected officials within our state. So the first thing to just recognize. But the way in which this changes voting is, again, for those offices that I had mentioned, it first changes our primary system. And so currently, right now, what we do in Colorado is that if you are a Democrat, you get your ballot and you get to select one Democrat that can move to the general election. If you are a Republican, you choose one Republican to move to the general election. If you are a Libertarian, you're only selecting a Libertarian. But what this would do is it would say, again, just for those offices that I had mentioned, it would put all of the individuals who are running for that office on the same ballot. So if you were to look at this and this were to pass, you would see on your primary ballot, Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians, you would see all of them on the same primary ballot. And then you would choose one of those individuals. And so then what would happen is your county election officials would then tally up all of those ballots, and the top 4 individuals who get the most number of votes would then move on to the general election. And so essentially, just what that means is that for your general election, you could see 3 Democrats and 1 Republican, or 4 Republicans, or maybe 2 Democrats, 2 independents. Hopefully you get the picture there. So then that's what you have for your primary election, again, just for those certain offices. And then what would happen is that for the general election for those offices, we would move to ranked choice voting. And so for those of you who aren't aware of what ranked choice voting is, what would happen is that you would get your general election ballot, and you would then be able to rank those individuals who have moved on to the general election. So you would be able to rank them 1 through 4. And then what would happen is your election official would take a look at all of the results. And if there is an individual who has the majority of votes, who has 50 plus 1 votes, then that person is the winner. But if there is not someone who has 50 plus 1 votes, or 50% plus 1 votes, then what would happen is the election officials would say, okay, well, we're going to see who has the least number of number 1 votes. And that individual who has the least number of number 1 votes would be eliminated from the kind of the running. But then those individuals who had voted for that individual, their number 2 choices would then be applied to the election or to the results. And so you then just keep on going until you have an individual who has, again, 50 plus 1% of those votes. So again, that's the way in which that would work. Again, we don't take a position at the Bell on this measure. Again, whenever we took a look at the rubric, it didn't kind of fall neatly, and we, even though we took a look at a lot of the things that have been happening around this space. And I will say, I think a large reason for that is because of how new these systems are. There are a couple states that have systems that are that have some similarities to this, or have some portions of this as part of their the way in which they elect folks. Alaska is the closest one, but they've only had it for about 3 or 4 years. So they have something that's really similar. Maine has, I think, a ranked choice voting system. California, Washington, they just use the open primary, which I had mentioned at the beginning, but they don't use the ranked choice voting. But all of this to be said, there just isn't a lot of evidence around exactly how propositions like these or election changes like these really impact long-term outcomes. So whenever we think about systems like these, a lot of folks who are in support of this will say, well, this is going to increase turnout, or this is going to make things more transparent, or maybe we'll have more third-party folks who are elected, but we don't have really enough evidence within this to say that there are really concrete results from this. I think that even some of the concerns that other folks have raised around how this impacts voting, or how, the confusion that this may or may not create, there isn't a lot of really good evidence on that either way. So for a lot of those reasons, those are some of the reasons that we have taken a no position on this one, but there is clearly a lot going on with it, and lots to think about.
So Andrea, because of the complexity on this one, I may ask you just a couple of questions here. So I know there's been some research out there about how many voters mismark their ballots when there's a transition to this system. What have you seen in the research about how many people mismark their ballots?
I think that's another place where some of the research is a bit mixed. That in places where we have seen, for example, Maine, for example, whenever it moved to a ranked choice voting system, they had a lot of folks just at the very beginning where there was a lot of confusion, where there were a lot of folks who were not turning in correct ballots. A much more sizable chunk than normal were disqualified because they weren't correctly processed, or they weren't correctly filled out. But I will say in the future elections, some of that got adjusted. I think that the big thing that a lot of folks have really talked about is that in order for a system like this to work really well, you need to do a lot of outreach to folks. You need to do a lot of education for people. And that, of course, always takes a lot of money. That takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of resources. And I think that raises also just another set of questions around who's paying for that, what does this look like, and how could this all come together, especially in some of our smaller or even more rural places. What does that look like?
Thank you. And one other question for you. So when we think about which races are covered under this new system and which are not, you mentioned the municipal and the school board races. Those are typically in the odd year, so those are not necessarily on the same ballot. But when you think about the races that are in the on year, we've got these county level races, we have district attorney races that will still be voted using a traditional partisan primary and general election method. How's that going to work for voters who have a traditional partisan primary for district attorneys and county races, and this new all candidate jungle primary system at the exact same time?
Yeah, I think that that's something that is going to take a lot of figuring out if this passes. I don't think that there is any clear understanding of exactly what could happen. There are two general ways in which it could potentially play out, most likely, is that there is the possibility that the county clerks would be able to put everything on one ballot, and there would just have to be some clarity that the clerks are providing around how you vote in this way, and the differentiations between how you're voting on certain races as opposed to others. There is also the possibility that what could happen is individuals could get two separate ballots. again, in the same election cycle. So you could get one where you are asked to do something like ranked choice voting or the all primary system. And again, that would just be for those state level races. But then, as you had mentioned, for those other races, you would just potentially get your separate ballot where you would have, again, just the Democrats, just the Republicans, et cetera. But it's really unclear right now exactly how that would work out. And that would have to be something, I think, that would be figured out by the state legislators and through state statute. But again, this is, I think, one of the other places that it's just a little bit unclear exactly how this would work in practice.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So we're starting, this is the last measure, so this is a great time for people to start putting their questions in the Q&A, whether it's about this one or something else. But this one is clearly driving some interest. So we have two questions that are popping up around this measure. So the first is, what are the proponents of 131 hoping for? Why are they running this measure in the first place?
So I think a lot of the folks that are running this measure would say that they want to ensure that people's voices are heard. I think some folks who are proponents of this would say that they don't feel as though the traditional way in which things are working with kind of with our current election system allows them to feel represented with, especially if you have an interest in voting for a third party candidate, that maybe you don't feel as though you can support that individual because you feel like you're wasting your vote. But with this, you wouldn't necessarily feel that way because you can also, your vote will be counted in another race or kind of for another candidate if that person isn't chosen. I think another thing that some of the proponents will say is that they feel as though this might lead to more moderation in politics and more moderate candidates who are selected. What I would say, though, is that as the evidence has come in on these, and I think that, again, this is really new. So there's not a lot of good evidence one way or another. But what has come out is that these elections and these types of election systems, that you may see maybe a different slate of candidates on your general election ballot, but it doesn't actually change who is elected. So you would see generally the same type of person, the same type of candidate who was elected, eventually. So I think there's a little bit of questions around exactly how effective it is at even achieving some of those goals. But again, something that may change as we move forward and there is more evidence around this.
Thank you. And Andrea, it looks like you're going to get all the questions tonight. So the next one is really about the cost to taxpayers. So can you tell us, how does the state fund its elections work, and what is the real life consequence of the state having to take on this additional cost of administering this more complex election system?
Yeah, so there is a fiscal note to this. And if I am remembering correctly, I believe that there is some additional funds that would go toward the helping to update like the IT system, everything else for the state. But then there's a larger fiscal note moving forward. If I am remembering correctly, I think it's about $6 million moving forward for this. So there is a fiscal note for this moving forward. I think one of the big things, though, that I would emphasize here is that that's kind of just the recognized fiscal note for how this would work within kind of the way in which this is recognized or the way in which this is currently written. But in order for these systems to work out really well, as had mentioned from before, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that you need a really robust voter education system and a really robust effort to tell people exactly how this is different, how this is changing across, how you've done this in the past, or else you do have a lot of these folks who are really confused because it is so new. So I think that there would be these additional costs that, yes, the state would have to bear, but then there's also questions around what this would do for your local governments. And so are they also picking up the cost to do this? So there is an across the board additional cost, especially at the beginning, for what this would look like moving forward.
Thank you. And I may just also add the strange interaction that Prop 131 ends up having with Tabor. So the Department of State is funded by business license fees. So fees that businesses pay to register with the state ends up covering all the expenses of the Department of State that include their business regulation, but also include the entire elections division. So what will have to happen if Prop 131 passes is we will have to increase business licensing fees in order to cover those costs at the State Department. But those dollars also count against the Tabor cap. So at the very same time that we're raising business licensing fees to cover these costs, we're going to have to take the equivalent dollar amount, whether it be 6 million or some larger amount, out of the general fund. And instead of spending that on priorities like K-12, higher education, and early childhood, we would end up returning that to the taxpayers in higher Tabor refunds. So just a very strange interaction. So, Carrie, why don't you take us to the next slide here? Because I think we're winding down unless others have questions they want to throw in the chat. There is still time, so if there are questions you're interested in asking, go ahead and put them in the Q&A right now, and we'll talk about those for a few more minutes. But we just wanted to put the link back up here one more time for ColoradoBallotGuide2024.com. We have both the English and Spanish versions of this, and this is a great link to text to your friends, because while we do have the comprehensive PDF that you can download, if you're a print at home and read it and scribble on your pages like I am, you can certainly access the PDF through this site. But this also has a great version you could just scroll through on your phone, where you can find whichever measure you're talking about and then read our full analysis at that time. So we will take one last call for questions. And if there are no more, we may just have an early wrap up and let everyone get back to their evening. All right, Carrie, why don't you take us to one more final slide here? This is all of our contact information at the Bell for our general inbox, and it also has all of our social media links. So if you're interested in following our activities on any of these social media platforms, it's all over there in the right-hand column. And I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us tonight. You know, these are difficult and complicated policies that the voters in Colorado have the responsibility of deciding because of our citizens initiative process and because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. So thank you for grappling with these questions and spending a little time to learn about the pros and cons of these measures before you return your ballots. And remember this for voting this year. Election Day is November 5th, but you don't have to wait until November 5th to vote. You can mail your ballots back. There are numerous drop boxes and vote centers in every county of Colorado. If your dog eats your ballot, you can even show up and have them print you a replacement ballot in real time. If you do intend to mail your ballots back, please make sure you do so by October 28th. But if your preference is to take it to one of the drop boxes, you can do that all the way until 7 p.m. on Tuesday, October 5th. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. Thanks for being active members of our democracy, and happy voting.